Welcome everyone to the Burning Archive live stream on Are We Sleepwalking to World War Again? How are today's events in the world, the war in Ukraine, the economic crisis, the political uncertainties, the wars and conflicts in various parts of the world, the enormous tensions between China and America over who's top dog in the world. That is the world crisis, and the question is, how similar is it to July 1914, the immediate prelude to World War One and all the catastrophes that happened in World War One. And in this live stream, I'm going to sort of bring together three things that I do on the Burning Archive channel. I'm going to talk about history. I'm going to talk, sort of introduce you to some really good recent books in history. I sort of do book reviews, but it's more I sort of help highlight a few quality books, quality history books that can help inform you about current issues, current debates in the world. And I'm also going to talk about geopolitics or the big issues in current world affairs and try to draw those together in an interesting kind of objective sort of way. Maybe not objective, but an interesting sort of way, let's say. I can only be as objective as I can. And my name's Jeff Rich. I do the Burning Archive YouTube channel, which you're watching right now. And I also do a podcast, the Burning Archive podcast, which comes out every week on a Friday, and that you can get on, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, the main sort of podcast platforms. And I also have a weekly free newsletter at jeffrich.substack.com, which you can type that into your browser now, sign up for free, and you'll get 7 glimpses of the multipolar world every Saturday morning from me, what I'm reading, what some of the big issues are, and some unusual and interesting reflections on culture, history of the whole multipolar world. So, the topic of today's live stream, which is my third live stream, so I'm starting to get the hang of it, and feel free to drop me a line in the chat there if you wish, or also you can, if you're watching it on the live replay later on, then please just leave me a comment and I'll respond. And I know there are a couple of comments to my live stream last week, which talked about the elections in Thailand and Turkey, as well as the sort of political crisis in Pakistan and in America, democracy's discontents, which I might get to later in the show. But today the question is, are we reliving World War One, and how can we learn from history about it? And there are 5 books that I really want to talk about in order to explore this comparison between 1914 and 2023. Explore this comparison between the conflict in Ukraine and the perhaps especially the economic conflict across between China, America, Russia, and I guess let's say the global South, and what happened in World War One, and I should also mention that I'm streaming today from Melbourne, Australia. It's, what is it? Today is the 23rd. Yes, it's the 23rd of May, 2023. It's 12:30 p.m. roughly on that day in Eastern Australia, and the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, is currently in Australia, and there's a very large Indian population in Australia welcoming him. He's doing some major events. It's really quite a significant diplomatic, geopolitical, cultural event with Narendra Modi's visit, and I may well talk about that on the stream next week. But this today's stream is about these 5 books, which I'm just showing you up there on the screen. It's Christopher Clark's Sleepwalkers, The Sleepwalkers, Robert Gerwaf's The Vanquished, Why the First World War Failed to End, Dominic Leven's Towards the Flame, and Adam Tooze's Deluge, and they're all current, contemporary, currently working or recently retired historians. And then the final book, 5th book, is a bit of a classic, you could say. One which I'm not necessarily putting forward in the same way as a recommendation so much, as one that's perhaps important to absorb the story from, and that is Winston Churchill. Yes, Winston Churchill, former Prime Minister of England, particularly Britain during World War II, and his book about the First World War and the world crisis that it emerged from, and that is the World Crisis. Part of a long series of books he wrote about World War One after World War One. So that's the topics for today. Do feel free to send in your comments or chat if you're with me live. But I'm doing these live streams partly just to give myself a bit of a break from video editing over the next couple of weeks and months, because I'm also sort of proofing and editing my next book, which is called 13 Ways of Looking at a Bureaucrat. So doing the live streams is a little bit easier, or it lightens the load a little bit in terms of video editing time for me. So I'd love to respond to your comments in that you might send commenting on the live replay, and I'll also send some shorts, highlights. I'll post some short highlights of this stream onto my YouTube channel. Now, what I should also say is that the literature on World War One, the historical literature, I mean, there's the fictional and poetic and journalistic literature on World War One, which is absolutely enormous. But the historic literature on World War One is also enormous. It's one of the most written about events, very complex event in historical literature. And it's also one which you'll find an awful lot of videos on YouTube, and I guess things like the History Channel, that sort of thing, on as well. And I'm not doing this video with the pretense that I'm fully across that literature. It's actually, in a way, too big for anyone to really be fully across, especially if you want to do it from the perspective of the whole multipolar world. You've got to look at it from Russia's point of view, and Germany's point of view, and Britain's point of view, France, and Africa, and India, and China, Japan. America as well. So it's absolutely enormous literature. And there is so much about it, so much written about it, and so much material about it. In fact, in one of the books that I'm going to talk about in Christopher Clark's The Sleepwalkers, he concludes his book, by writing that, referring to the novelist Rebecca West, looking back in 1938 to the conflict and saying, we will never know why it happened, not because there are too few facts, but because there are too many. And that's part of the issue with World War One. You can, in terms of making use of so much, there is so much material out there. But it's easy to, I guess, get in a certain groove of telling the story about World War One without realising it's a very partial story, and that's partly because it's just it's almost humanly impossible to actually orient yourself to so much written and visual material. Of course, there's cinema and there's photographs and all the rest of it. There's all the museums, and I mean, I can just show you. I've just, out of my own little personal library and a quick trip to the public library. Oh, it's like doing weight training, just gathered. I mean, there's about a dozen books right there, some of which are absolutely fabulous books, like Margaret Macmillan's The War That Ended the Peace, or a book on the Indian Empire at war, telling the story of World War One from the Indian perspective. And classics like John Keegan's The First World War, or Hugh Strawn's The First World War. So enormous amount of literature, and I'm not pretending to be absolute scholar of all this sort of stuff. I'm just someone who, maybe like you, is reasonably well educated, reasonably well informed, and is looking at how the world is, shaking out today and going, what the hell is going on, and how on earth can I make sense of it, and how can I draw on some of the best historical writing today to not necessarily find the answers, but at least explore some of one's own judgments and intuitions a little bit better. And of course, anything as complicated as a world crisis, either in 1914 or in 2023, can be told from many, many, many different perspectives. I, live in an English language speaking country, which is, its media and its education institutions, its political culture, dominated by, I guess, the Anglo-American heritage, and you get a very particular take on World War One, indeed World War Two, and the Cold War from that sort of Anglo-American historical heritage. And what's more, so it's good to look out for some different perspectives, but without wanting to get absolutely, caught in the headlights of there being so many choices to choose from. Where on earth in all that enormous literature do you begin? And that's, I hope, what this kind of video or this live stream can help you with. What's more, we're so sort of bombarded with simple or simplistic narratives of both World War One, World War Two, and the world crisis today. It's very much, it's what people are responding to, in the sense that there's a bit of a propaganda message going on in the media about this conflict, and the art of propaganda has always been a feature of world wars, but it was certainly a key feature of World War One as well. But it's often in those sort of simplistic stories about what's going on today and what happened in 1914, or how today is similar to, Munich 1938, and we need to stop appeasing the dictators. There are a whole lot of assumed similarities, and I think it's good to look at some different perspectives and some different books about World War One to enrich our comparisons of things, and to think a little bit differently about today's world crisis, with the benefit of a more rounded, or at least some different multipolar glimpses into the history of the World War One, the Great War, as it was called back then. And people are, interestingly enough, making comparisons between events today and events back in 1914. For example, when Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, and Xi Jinping, the leader of China, met in Moscow for a summit I think it was in March. Xi Jinping said to Vladimir Putin as he was leaving, the world today is going through changes it hasn't seen for 100 years, and we are guiding these changes together. So what happened 100 years ago? Well, what happened 100 years ago was World War One and its consequences, the human catastrophe of World War One, the collapse of empires and the remaking of empires, the fundamental shifts in the economies of the world, in the culture and in the political systems and the diplomatic systems of the world, the international relations systems of the world. But it's not just Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, who some of you might regard as, unreliable witnesses, even though they think they're leading these biggest changes in 100 years. There are others who say the same thing. For example, the journalist Martin Wolf, who's a very establishment journalist at the Financial Times, a sort of, you could almost call him like a court historian of globalization. He wrote in 2019, so several years ago, and I guess, between 2014, like 2014 to 2019 was the centenary of World War One through to the Treaty of Versailles, and as a result, there was a huge amount of historical writing and commemorative activities and journalistic articles and documentaries and TV shows, etc., which kind of explored, new thinking or commemorated the suffering and the events of World War One. And so it was very much of a piece, and quite a few of the articles, of the books rather, that I'm going to talk about today were actually produced in that period as part of that effort. There was clearly a huge market for, there's always, I think, a big market for books about World War One and World War Two. Certainly on the History Channel there appears to be, and on many of the other history channels on YouTube. but there was a huge market for these for books about World War One, and many people were reflecting at that time, back in 2019, about how the world has changed, or how there are some similarities between today and 2014. And back then, Martin Wolf said that today's era is a mixture of all three of these. It is marked by a conflict of political systems and ideology between two superpowers, as in the Cold War, by a post-financial crisis, decline of confidence in democratic politics and market economics, as well as by the rise of populism, nationalism and authoritarianism, as in the 1930s, and most significantly by a dramatic shift in relative economic power with the rise of China, as with the US before 1914. For the first time, where are we? For the first time, I've lost my place. Just give me a second there. For the first time since then, the US faces a power with an economic potential exceeding its own. So you get some of the themes there that people are talking about. But more than that, also within the broader culture, it was a sense that there was a dramatic change in sensibility and culture in the world in that early second decade of the 20th century. So many of the great works of literary modernism and musical modernism were in those first two decades. The shock and horror of the war had a profound impact on people's cultural sensibilities, but in some ways those cultural sensibilities were also changing before World War One. Virginia Woolf, the great British writer, novelist and essayist, diarist, Virginia Woolf wrote that on, or in her sort of kind of fey, charming sort of way, on or about December 1910, human nature changed. All human relations shifted. And when human relations change, there is at the same time a change in religion, conduct, politics, and literature. And this sense that human relations perhaps are also changing, maybe, I don't know, December 2016 perhaps, or December 2010, let's say, or December 2014, to choose an arbitrary date in the recent times, perhaps March 2020. That sense that there's been a fundamental shift in the people's personal lives, their actual cultural lives, and then that is also flowing through into these sort of big macro issues of politics and war and economics that people talk about all the time in geopolitics. And that's my sense too, and why I say on the Burning Archive podcast that we are going through a crisis or a change that we haven't really seen for 100 years, and it has both a international relations dimension, a geopolitical dimension, a social dimension, by which I would include, economics and all that sort of stuff. It also has a political dimension, democracy, how well is it performing, or that sort of thing. The rise of new non-Western democracies, non-Western models of democracies, and also a profound sense of cultural change. So there are these common elements to that period back in the 1910s to our era today, perhaps from the 2010s and certainly in the 2020s. So that's the kind of world crisis. Now let me, another aspect of that is we get this recurring metaphor that we're sleepwalking to war, which is a famous phrase describing events. Just for example, there is this essay that came out in Australia not so long ago by Hugh White called Sleepwalk to War, Australia's Unthinking Alliance with America. And that same metaphor is the one used in the first book that we're going to discuss, Christopher Clark's Sleepwalkers. Now, I haven't prepared little slides of each of the books, but let me just show you Christopher Clark's book there. It came out, I think, in 2013, maybe 2014, 2012, there you go. 2012, and I think he described writing it against the background of the Eurozone crisis, and it apparently was actually quite an influential book in German, because Christopher Clark is a historian who's written histories of Germany and is widely respected about that, and his book came out sort of on the eve of the start of the Ukraine crisis in 2013, 2014. And as a result, people would draw comparisons between that. And the sleepwalkers metaphor, I guess, comes out in the final sentence in the book. And it's just this idea that people, the political leaders of World War One, somehow or other, unwittingly perhaps, led themselves down the primrose path of disaster, and also caused an absolute catastrophe for their peoples. In this sense, Christopher Clark writes, the protagonists of 1914 were sleepwalkers, watchful but unseeing, haunted by dreams, yet blind to the reality of the horror they were about to bring into the world. So yes, Christopher Clark's Sleepwalkers, really terrific book, and a couple of key points to bring out about it. First of all, like all part of the joy of a really great historian like Christopher Clark is that it's sort of in the details and the texture and the characters that he brings out. One of the things I like about looking at the big issues in current world affairs and geopolitics from a perspective of history rather than a perspective of economics or international relations is, I think, history is far more attuned to the eccentricity of people and their individual characters and how they, I guess, they dramatise the sometimes dull events that they're involved in dramatic ways. And there are some fantastic examples of that in Christopher Clark's book. One, for example, is one of the leading French diplomats, who was the ambassador to Russia, who was perhaps not the world's greatest diplomat, but was a very fine writer, in a way, a fine dramatic presenter of the events that he was kind of participating as, an ambassador to Russia. And he would present events quite imaginatively. But he also had some, real powers of insight. Unfortunately, I haven't written down his name here, but he commented how during the July 1914 crisis that led to World War One, it was a tragic poker game of bluffing between the great states. And he observed later, as he sort of wrote up his memoirs, that the man of action, and forgive the gendered language, but we'll just quote his actual words, the man of action becomes, and here I quote, a gambler, for each grave action implies not only an anticipation of the future, but a claim to be able to decide events, to lead and control them. And the ability to do this is seen as the mark of genius among political leaders. It is always sought, it is always believed to be possessed. It is always an illusion. A very, I think, insightful comment from French diplomat and ambassador to Russia in 1914, who, if I make an edited version of this live stream, I will include his actual name and perhaps his photograph as well. So Christopher Clark's full of some of those great insights, and that comment in particular, I think, is one that is very relevant to events today, because what have we got? We have people attempting to control events, perhaps being caught up again in the illusion of control. Perhaps Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin are in an illusion about their ability to control these greatest changes that haven't been, or drive these changes that haven't been seen for 100 years. Perhaps Emmanuel Macron and Joe Biden are similarly under an illusion that they can control events as well. Perhaps it's all falling out of control. And that is one of the key themes, I guess, about Christopher Clark's book, The Sleepwalkers. Excuse me a second. Christopher Clark's book, Sleepwalkers, because it has that, it includes that sort of irrationality and that complexity of decision making. One of his key themes is complexity itself. That World War One is, one of perhaps the most. It can be conceived as a single event. It began at a certain time and ended at a certain time and involved places and people, but it is perhaps one of the most complex events ever, and so explanations of it similarly ought to be complex. And I think that comment is equally applicable to today's world crisis. If World War One was complex, what about a conflict that is not just between Russia and Ukraine, but involving all the world and across many, many dimensions? It similarly is a spectacularly complicated event, one that is almost beyond our ability to comprehend, and that so we have to be really careful about how we boil it down into digestible narratives to make sure that those narratives are not illusions of control. Okay, so, and the other aspect of that that Christopher Clark really brings out and is a major commentary on the literature of World War One is the whole question of who caused the war, who carries the guilt of the war, who should be blamed for the war. Was it Germany? Was it England? Was it Britain? Was it France? Was it Russia? Was it America? Was it NATO? Was it Ukraine? That whole question is perhaps not a very useful question to ask. He actually says, ultimately, he makes the point that, he comments on, and the whole question of war guilt is fundamental to the literature of World War One, and I guess World War Two, arguably also the Cold War, and certainly the Russia-Ukraine War. But it's particularly important in World War One because at the end of World War One, the Treaty of Versailles included a particular, attribution of war guilt and hence reparations, etc. An unusual new sort of move that people responded to, people reacted badly to, I guess. And Christopher Clark comments that he fundamentally says we don't really need to do this to try to attribute to a single country, to a single person, to a single nation blame for an event as complicated as World War One. Accounts structured around blame come with built-in assumptions that one protagonist is ultimately right or wrong. They avoid multilateral processes of interaction. They focus on, what was so-and-so's intention rather than how did things work out between them in a way that no one really controlled. And they also construct state actors and key decision makers as performing planned actions with coherent intentions, and so much of the documentation and the evidence and the new histories about World War One highlight the fact that there wasn't, a single coherent decision-making executive holding together these empires or these states as single rational agents. They were very complicated fields of competing ideas, competing motives, competing interests, and a lot of confusion as well. In the end, Christopher Clark, that is, says there is no smoking gun in this story, or rather there is one, or if there is one, it is in the hands of every major character. Viewed in this light, the outbreak of war was a tragedy, not a crime. Okay, so that's now the other point I just kind of really wanted to highlight, I think that's particularly relevant out of Christopher Clark's book, is this whole idea of divided executives that in all the, and he brings it out brilliantly in his discussion, that all the different states like Austria-Hungary and Russia and Germany and Britain, probably also America, had there was not just one view, one decision maker, one source of power, that all the executives were divided and fragmented and had wrestled and within themselves as to what decisions to take. There were also people with influence in, like, individual diplomats or elites in particular countries or colonies or institutions who also were able to sort of make it more complicated, make the whole diplomatic machine more complicated and complex. And surely that is one of the features that we have right now. Everyone is talking about the arguments within the American executives between the realists and the neocons. And perhaps even that is an oversimplification. Is Joe Biden really in charge, or who is? And there's no doubt similarly differing views within Russia. There's no doubt differing perspectives within Volodymyr Zelensky's government in Ukraine. And that all just makes it a lot more complicated and a lot more important that people kind of put themselves in each other's shoes and be aware that misperception about what their counterparts are thinking, what pressures are on them, what factors are leading to their decisions, what level of control they have over their decision-making processes, what level of control they have over the political, social, military processes that they've launched, but may not really be fully in charge of. That all is fundamental to the course of the war and the complexity of the event of World War One, and I guess the world crisis we're having today. The sort of way I think about Christopher Clark's book is he almost imagines this big, complicated event of World War One in a sense like a really complicated force field, rather than in a sort of simplified economist's game of individual rational agents of, free of, two, a buyer and a seller, an enemy and an ally. It's a much more complicated picture of how such an event, historical event, unfolds. So it's a really fine book. And one of the other things, just on that whole misperception thing, is he comments particularly about how Austria-Hungary was widely speculated to be an empire in decline prior to World War One, and that it would inevitably break up, and that would lead to that kind of created this emotional, psychological, political, cultural, social pressure on the decision-making elites in Austria-Hungary to ratchet up the importance of any decisions they take, making them not just any old decisions, but they were statements of their right to exist. And you can see some of the same, and he Christopher Clark, that is, refers to aspect of decision theory called an opt-in decision, in which there is a belief that the decision could reinvent the decision-making entity, and where there are issues core to identity that cannot be routinized into decision-making. And as a result, at the core of their decisions, the Austro-Hungarian Empire's decisions were made against a background of concern that they were a rotting empire, and they therefore it encouraged them to make a temperamental, intuitive leap a naked act of decision founded in a shared understanding of what the Austro-Hungarian Empire was and must be if it were to remain a great power. And I was very much struck by this comment. Many Western commentators say, Vladimir Putin's whole raison d'etre is a kind of reassertion of Russia's status as a great power. So some people would argue that kind of, and it's commonly referred to as this is an existential decision, an existential conflict for Russia. But I think similarly, probably there's similar kind of aspects of decision making going on in America. After all, making America great again, fear of American decline, fear of the loss of American hegemony seems to be a big factor in American decision making, especially after the humiliation of their defeat in Afghanistan. Joe Biden claims that he is, in a struggle to redeem the American soul, and that he's again trying to make the world safe for democracy. So I do wonder whether we have some of these similar opting decisions, these similar approaches to things that come through, and it is a little bit that means we're not really sleepwalking to war. We're almost, let's say, chest beating ourselves to war. And Christopher Clark says that in World War One, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, under these pressures, sought transformative, bold actions so that Austria-Hungary would again believe in itself. It would mean, I have the will, therefore I am. And I guess that's a worry, isn't it? Because if our big world leader decision makers are driven by those kind of factors, it could well mean they make reckless decisions. They decide to, reclaim Crimea. They decide to invade Taiwan. They decide to risk nuclear weapons in some way or another in order not to suffer a humiliation. So I think that is a really interesting insight from Christopher Clark's book around sleepwalkers that helps us perhaps understand some of not just the geopolitical dynamics, but some of the decision-making dynamics affecting some of our leaders at the moment, and how perhaps it is kind of a good time to bring down some of the cultural heat in our perceptions of the what military success or failure, what economic success or failure might mean for the identity of the American empire or the Russian state, or indeed the European Union of NATO. So Christopher Clark, absolutely fabulous book. The top line things I would say about it are that it brilliantly portrays the World War One as it brilliantly portrays World War One. Christopher Clark's Sleepwalkers brilliantly portrays World War One as the most complex event perhaps known to history, and one in which no one is really to blame, that it is, or rather everyone is to blame. And if everyone is to blame, perhaps we should stop talking about blame and look at the sheer complexity of events and the pressures on decision makers and how they handle those well and how they handle them not so well. And in particular, he also emphasizes how in 1914 a profound sundering of ethical and political perspectives eroded consensus and sapped trust. There were rapid-fire interactions among heavily armed autonomous power centres confronting different and swiftly changing threats and operating under conditions of high risk and low trust and transparency. And when I read that, I was, struck by the similarities with today. So it would be good, I guess, if we kind of worked on that, the frameworks and the institutions and the culture of trust, so that the big international decisions are not made in such a vexed, dangerous environment. Again, I don't think anyone's sleepwalking to war, but we could very easily chest beat ourselves into war. Okay, second book, and I've probably spent more time on Christopher Clark, so I'm going to be a bit quicker with some of the other books here. But I mean, Christopher Clark's book gave the show its title, so I may as well spend a bit more time, and it's a really great, insightful book. Okay, so the second book that I want to focus on is Robert Gerwaf's The Vanquished, and that's it here, and it's subtitled Why the First World War Failed to End 1917 to 1923. The First World War didn't end? What do you mean by that? And it's a fascinating and counterintuitive idea. But of course, what happens in 1917? Well, first of all, there's the Russian Revolution, which leads to a civil war in Russia, which lasts 4 or 5 years. There is a revolution in Germany in 1918, including deep conflicts, etc. And there are enormous conflicts in the Ottoman Empire and in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And The Vanquished, Why the First World War Failed to End, explores the after effects of World War One. After England and France and America had gone home, there were these catastrophic and deadly conflicts in Central and Eastern Europe, in which millions of people died, and it's a really terrific book, especially if you exist in like the milieu I have of being largely exposed to Anglo-American language writing about the events, and what Gerwaf says is that he aims to move beyond the more familiar histories of Britain and France, or the equally well-known story of peacemaking on the Western Front in 1918. It aims to reconstruct the experiences of people living in those countries that were on the losing side in the Great War. The Habsburg, Austro-Hungary, Romanov, Russia, Hohenzollern, Germany, and Ottoman empires and their successor states, as well as Bulgaria. And any history of the vanquished also has to include Greece and Italy. So this is a pretty large part of Europe, so it's actually really quite a brilliant account of all this that gives us a gives us a totally different perspective. And he comments that even if one deems the recent scholarly rehabilitation of the pre-war land empires exaggerated or overstated, and there's a whole lot of literature on like the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian pre-1917 sort of states were not quite as, terrible or as, cliche dictatorship, autocratic kind of thing as people, particularly in the Anglo-American tradition, have presented them. It is difficult to suggest that post-imperial Europe was a better, safer place than it had been in 1914. Not since the 30 Years' War of the 17th century had a series of interconnected wars and civil wars in Europe been as inchoate and deadly as in the years after 1917 to 18. As civil wars overlapped with revolutions, counter-revolutions and border conflicts between emerging states without clearly defined frontiers or internationally recognised governments, post-war Europe between the official end of the Great War in 1918 and the Treaty of Lausanne in July 1923, we're coming up to its 100th anniversary, was the most violent place on the planet. So this excellent book will totally transform your, just throwing the book down there, sorry for the noise, but it will totally transform your understanding of World War One and how it relates to today, because one of those, the Russian Civil War, some of those border conflicts were fought around Ukraine. The history of Ukraine in the period 1918-1919 can be mythologized now by some nationalist historians, but there were multiple, 4 or 5 governments in different years and all sorts of different kind of conflicts. So it is, in fact, this history of the vanquished is directly relevant to the conflict, the world crisis today. So it's a highly recommended book. So Robert Gerwaf's The Vanquished will tell you things you probably don't know about the history of war in Ukraine. It will change your perspective on whether World War One really ended in 1918. It will bring your attention to the deadly, tragic and complicated history of war, civil war, revolution and counter-revolution that affected a huge part of Central and Eastern Europe in the years after 1918. And it will help you reimagine the story of today and the legacy of the World War One in today's world crisis. Okay, third book that we're looking at, and please everyone, if anyone's viewing, do send us a chat, and if not, please feel free to leave us a comment in the video after the sort of replay video. The third book that we're going to look at is Dominique Leven, Towards the Flame, Empire, War and the End of Tsarist Russia. And this book was written, I'll just put up the little summary for you all. Dominique Leven, Towards the Flame. This book was published in 2015. And the first sentence of the book I'll just read it to you because, of course, part of the world crisis today is the conflict in Ukraine. And the first paragraph or so of the book goes like this. As much as anything, the First World War turned on the fate of Ukraine. To an English-speaking audience, this statement will seem final confirmation that most professors are crazy. No Allied soldier believed he was risking his life over Ukraine. Few of them had heard of the place. The same was true of German soldiers in 1914. In connection with the war's centenary, a flood of books will be published in English. Very few will mention Ukraine. Most of these books will be about the experience of British Dominion and American soldiers and civilians during the war. Many others will debate the impact of the war on the society and culture of the English-speaking world. Ukraine's fate had nothing to do with any of this. But no, in fact, what Dominic Lieven does brilliantly in this book is he writes a Russian history, the history of World War I from the perspective of the Russian Empire, which, of course, at that point in 1914 included Ukraine, included parts of what's now Poland, and quite a few other places as well. And so again, he makes the point, the key point, that the conflict in Ukraine was contrary, and here I quote, contrary to the near universal assumption in the English-speaking world, the war was first and foremost an Eastern European conflict. So I won't go into so much detail about Dominic Lieven's book, but again, if you really want to understand the world crisis today, it is worth looking at some of the histories of Ukraine written by various people, but they do tend to be written from an extremely nationalist viewpoint, like Serhii Plokhy's works. So it's really good to look at other scholars as well. Richard Sakwa for more recent times, and I think Dominic Lieven, if you're looking particularly at World War I, reading Dominic Lieven's Towards the Flame will shift your perspective. The centrality of the conflict, of Russia's role in World War I, the complexity of Russia's role in World War I, and it will also give you a much more international perspective on the Russian Revolution itself. That crucial event in 1917, or the two Russian revolutions in 1917, that defined so much of the history for the world, as well as the Soviet Union in the 20th century. It's a brilliant book. It focuses on the characters and the individuals and the systems and the ideas of the diplomats of Russia, the leaders of Russia, and gives you a totally different insight into World War I than you would get out of the History Channel. I'd love to know what the best Russian writers of history of World War I are writing today around World War I, but that's not really readily accessible to me at the moment. But Dominic Lieven is as good a start as you can get. Okay, the fourth book I'm going to look at is, and I'll bring up our little label here, our little tagline thing here, our little summary, Adam Tooze, The Deluge. And that's it here, Adam Tooze, The Deluge. And this this book is subtitled "The Great War and the Remaking of Global Order." And this is a bit of a different book because Adam Tooze is not primarily a military historian or an imperial historian. He's primarily an economic historian, and he's also actually a quite interesting commentator on economic events. He's written a whole series of histories of the financial crises of the world over the last 20 or 30 years, I guess. There's a book called Crash. There's a book called Shutdown. And in a way, Deluge is the sort of prelude to those books about the modern financial crises of the world, because he sort of describes how World War One was a military conflict, sure, but it was also an economic conflict. It was a European war, but it was also a war in which America's economic dominance, its diplomatic, strategic dominance of Europe was also asserted. America might have been late into the war from a military point of view, but it was not at all late into the war from a geopolitical point of view. And that World War One really was the beginning, more so than World War Two, of the emergence of America as a kind of super state in the world system, a super state established through both a economic and particularly a financial dominance of other states and other countries, other economies, but also a kind of ideological dominance. It's the sort of first emergence of the liberal rules-based order in the form of Woodrow Wilson's progressive internationalism that is the dominant intellectual force, so to speak, behind so many of the ideas around the Treaty of Versailles, and also that provoked that created by trying to assert America's dominance as a superstate, also laid the groundwork for subsequent conflicts. So it's really essential, I think, reading around understanding World War One, the American century, and the truth or the reality or the falsehood of the liberal rules-based international order, and America's part in World War One. It's very common, I think, from American commentators to describe World War One and World War Two as conflicts which were European wars that Europe came in and saved Europe from. And I guess we've learned from Robert Gerwarth that, well, they didn't really save them, because there were these catastrophic conflicts that followed on, and America was a party to the civil war in Russia. It sent soldiers in there, as did Britain, and rather than save Europe, it if you like, it enslaved Europe financially. It asserted its dominance, and it had dramatic consequences. It was a growing power before then, but it became, and not accidentally, not entirely peacefully, not entirely without cunning and intent. So and there's a key paragraph that summarizes what Adam Tooze's book has to say about the American century. And if this is so essential, because if we go back to what Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin were saying, these are changes that haven't been seen for 100 years. The financial, institutional, international, diplomatic relations, liberal ideology kind of changes established, led by America in the wake of World War One, were sorry, I just got distracted by a message there, and I've just lost my train of thought. Set up, if you like, the international system where America is the superstate. It's set up the American century. It's set up both the institutions, the levers of power, the banks of power, the arsenal of democracy, and the sort of ideological, institutional sort of superstructure that has now grown old and tired and no longer well suited to the multipolar world. But this book describes its birth and its consequences. And he says the entire story told in this book, from peace without victory, which was Wilson's phrase, down to the Hoover Moratorium of 1931, is inflected by this basic impulse on behalf of successive United States administrations to use America's position of privileged detachment and the dependence on it of the other major world powers to frame a transformation in world affairs. The revolution in Europe and Asia that was as yet far from complete must be allowed to run its full course. This was in many respects a liberal and progressive project according to the terms defined by the US. Peace between the great powers, disarmament, commerce, progress, technology, communication were its watchwords, but fundamentally in its view of America itself, in its conceptions of what might be asked of America, the project was profoundly conservative. Wilson and Hoover had wished a revolutionary transformation upon the rest of the world to uphold their ideal of America's destiny. So this is a brilliant book which I highly recommend everyone read to understand World War One and the crisis we have today. And then the final book is a bit of a different one. Let me just summarize Adam Tooze. So in The Deluge by Adam Tooze, The Great War and the Remaking of World Order, he brilliantly retells the fundamental role of America in World War One and how it was at that time in World War One where America emerges really as the superstate, as the world's dominant power, based in financial power and based in a very let's say, insular view of America's rightful dominance of the world. And it is, as much as anything, the decay of this idea, this set of institutions, this first founding of the international liberal rules-based order that is collapsing today. And that is amongst the crucial comparisons that powers like Russia and China are noticing and the reason why today's events are the biggest changes the world has seen for 100 years. Okay, finally, we're going to look at The World Crisis by Winston Churchill. Of course, Winston Churchill was later the Prime Minister of Britain in World War II. In World War One, he was also a minister. I'm not exactly sure what minister he was, but he was responsible for, amongst other things, the Gallipoli campaign and a few pretty terrible things that happened in India over a number of decades prior to World War II as well. He's, I guess, still fondly remembered in some British quarters, some Anglo-American quarters. Boris Johnson, I think, might have even written a biography of him and was perhaps quite obsessed by him. And former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott was also heavily involved, heavily identified with Winston Churchill. There was a period in the last few months of Tony Abbott's prime ministership where he was seen to be under siege, and there were rumours that he was spending too much time sitting in his study reading Winston Churchill and ruminating over the world crisis. And that's perhaps not really something I would recommend anyone do. I don't really recommend Winston Churchill as a good guide to today's crisis, or indeed a good guide to World War One. But it is perhaps important to read Winston Churchill's The World Crisis to understand the story that so many Anglo-American leaders tell to themselves about World War One. They still tell the story, I guess, of the British Empire saving Europe in World War One, and not just in World War One, but in World War Two and in multiple previous occasions. And this myth, this form of story, the story of the great liberal empire that saves the world, has been handed down, if you like, to America. It is the same story that Americans tell themselves about how they saved Europe in World War One, how they saved Europe in World War Two, how they saved Europe in the Cold War, and how, God damn it, they're having to save Europe again in Ukraine. All the time not noticing the fact that Europe is full of American soldiers. So I'm not really recommending Winston Churchill as a guide to today's events or World War One's events so much as one of those fundamental texts that created the sort of stories and the myths that are still told today. And you can get this from reading the very first pages, a couple of pages of Winston Churchill's The World Crisis, 1911-1918. And notice those dates, 1911-1918. I referred earlier on to Virginia Woolf's famous comment that in December 2010, human nature changed. So he opens the book in chapter 1, The Vials of Wrath. It was the custom in the palmy days of Queen Victoria for statesmen to expatiate upon the glories of the British Empire and to rejoice in that protecting providence which had preserved us through so many dangers and brought us at length into a secure and prosperous age. Little did they know the worst perils had still to be encountered, and that the greatest triumphs were yet to be won. And much more flowery language than Americans tend to use today, but it's fundamentally the same idea that the American Empire, or the American Republic, is that protecting providence whose greatest days are before it. Children were taught of the Great War against Napoleon as the culminating effort in the history of the British peoples, and they looked on Waterloo and Trafalgar as the supreme achievements of British arms by land and sea. And just to comment there that, of course, Dominique Leven, who wrote the book Towards the Flame that I referred to earlier, also has a brilliant book about, I think it's called Russia and Napoleon, which basically describes how it wasn't really the British who defeated Napoleon, it was actually Russia. But this is the myth making that is going on in this book, and that is still dominant, I guess, in most of the stories people tell. These prodigious victories, eclipsing all that had gone before, seemed the fit and predestined ending to the long drama of our island race, which had advanced over 1,000 years from small and weak beginnings to a foremost position in the world. 3 separate times in 3 different centuries had the British people rescued Europe from a military domination. Thrice had the Low Countries been assailed by Spain, by the French monarchy, by the French Empire. Thrice had British war and policy, often maintained single-handed, overthrown the aggressor. Always at the outset, the strength of the enemy had seemed overwhelming. Always the struggle had been prolonged through many years and across awful hazards. Always the victory had at last been won, and the last of all the victories had been the greatest of all, gained after the most ruinous struggle and over the most formidable foe. Surely that was the end of the tale, as it was so often the end of the book. History showed the rise, culmination, splendour, transition, and decline of states and empires. It seemed inconceivable that the same series of tremendous events through which, since the days of Queen Elizabeth, we had 3 times made our way successfully, should be repeated a 4th time, and on an immeasurably larger scale. Yet that is what happened and what we have lived to see. It's basically a story of and I can't quite find the exact phrase, but it's basically a story of how how Britain saved Europe 3 times, and then they did it again in World War One. And that same mythology has sort of passed itself down to America today. America saved Europe in World War One. They saved Europe in World War Two. They saved Europe in a world war, in the Cold War, and now they're saving Europe again in Cold War Two in Ukraine. So I wouldn't recommend Winston Churchill's The World Crisis, 1911 to 1919, as a guide to understanding World War One factually, but it is crucial to understanding the kind of myths and narratives that are still told today about World War One and Britain's role in World War One, and that have been inherited by America and the American Empire, the American Republic, if you prefer, in its stories about how World War One, World War Two, the Cold War, and even today, the world crisis today, the fight in Ukraine, is all about America saving the world, America saving Europe, America being the providential protector of freedom and prosperity in the world. It's also incidentally interesting because he highlights just what a bad state of Britain was, how close to political collapse, in a way, Britain came in the first 20 years of the 20th century. And that too has echoes of today. Our political systems are highly, highly stressed. And democracy, is perhaps not all it's cracked up to be. So I do recommend reading Winston Churchill's The World Crisis from that perspective, from both understanding one of the key players, appreciating the extraordinary prose that Winston Churchill produced, and there's a lot of it, and also, but also primarily understanding the myth making that still dominates so much of the Anglo-American history, the Anglo-American political culture, the Anglo-American sort of myths of history of the 20th century. So they're my 5 books. Again, let's just do a quick recap of these 5 books. Sorry about that. Okay. So 5 books. The 5 books I recommend to really understand World War One from a new perspective and the world crisis today are Christopher Clark's Sleepwalkers, How Europe Went to War in 1914, Robert Gerwaf's The Vanquished, Dominique Leven's Towards the Flame, Adam Tooze's The Deluge, and Winston Churchill's The World Crisis. If you read these books, you'll get fresh perspectives on World War One. You'll understand the connections of the world crisis, and you will understand it from a much more multipolar perspective, how World War One affected Eastern and Central Europe, and that how World War One didn't really end in 1918 in Eastern and Central Europe, how the Anglo-American powers mythologized World War One in a very eccentric way, or a very grand way, or a very ideological way, and how World War One really established America as the superstate of the world, and its crumbling today is amongst the biggest changes the world has seen for 100 years. Okay, so finally then, let's just make a couple of wrap-up comments on all of this. I'll just have a quick check if there's... Oh, hey, fish. Thanks for that. Thanks for the comment about thanking for the recommendations. I've sort of not been paying enough attention to the chat and the live stream numbers, but I've just been focusing on delivering the content. So, so just a couple of wrap-up comments. Again, I think what we're seeing today compared to World War One is a similar kind of reordering of the great states of the world. Some of the empires are imploding. Some of them are remaking themselves in new, stronger forms. And I use empires not in a judgmental sense, in a more neutral sense of just a form of dominion over other states. I think we're looking at the end of that era of the US superstate, to use the term that comes out of Adam Tooze's book, The Deluge. And that is, I think, increasingly clear. And I think it's good to think of it in the very specific ways that you can think of it, related to these kind of events and these kind of institutions, rather than just as a repetition of the fall of Rome. This is the end of a particular unique historical configuration, one that had a, luck is perhaps too trivial a word to describe the actual, the consequences of World War II, but both World War One, World War Two, World War Two, and then the end of the Cold War, both institutionalized, I guess, American superstate dominance, but also, I think, lulled America into a false sense of its historical unique destiny. And I think the power base of that superstate is now collapsing, but similarly the cultural, ideological base of that superstate is collapsing. In a way, we're seeing the end of the Anglo-American era that Dominic Levin has commented has really been, the dominant empires of the world for the last 300 years. And that is also one of those things, going back to Virginia Woolf's comment, that we're going to see human nature change, if you like. It's not just going to be a Netflix world for the next 1,000 years. We're actually going to see other cultures, other civilizations come to the fore, and the Anglo-American civilization, if you like, decline. And then there's also the importance of misperception in world affairs and international relations. World War One, unbelievably complex, too complex for anyone to master and control events, and yet statespeople in World War One suffered the illusion, as that French diplomat in Russia said, that they could master and control events, but it was always an illusion. And we see today, perhaps with Jake Sullivan and Victoria Nuland, or the grand strategists of the world like Zbigniew Brzezinski and co, Robert Kagan, etc., that they can master events. In fact, I doubt that is really true. They perhaps need to accept a more modest part in the world. And then finally, I guess, it also emphasizes the importance of viewing history from a world perspective, a multipolar world perspective, not just relying on what you get on the History Channel or the sort of standard Anglo-American sort of YouTube accounts of World War One and World War Two and the Cold War, to actually hear about the stories from Russia, from Eastern and Central Europe, the story of the victors and the story of the vanquished, the stories of China and Japan and the global South, and sort of see how the perspective changes when you hear about their stories as well. And I'd love to hear if there are any historians of World War One, or indeed the 20th century, I guess, if you like, who happen upon this YouTube video, who want to share their perspective when they're not like the sort of outside of the Anglo-American sort of cultural complex, if you like. Chinese, Japanese, German, Russian, Eastern European, African, Indian. I'd really be interested in sort of contemporary Indian perspectives on World War One as a global conflict and how it compares to the global crisis today, and how what role World War One and World War Two subsequently played in India's move to independence in 1947 and 1948. Then, lastly, I guess the other key point about all of this is, you need to be mindful of your historical narratives. You need to not get too caught up in myths that have become common, and because of the sheer complexity and the sheer superabundance of details and facts and images about these really complicated but significant events that we need to understand but we cannot possibly understand, you need to always be mindful that there's another way of telling the story of World War One that may not present your country in quite as great a light, and that may not present your beliefs about how the world has come to be the way it has in as great a light. So that's the show for today, folks. Let me see, how long have I been going? A bit more than an hour and a half. I might just have a quick sip on Coke. If anyone wants to throw in a quick chat now, or if they've got any questions now, do grab your chance. And if not, I might just close out the video with just a reminder that you can get my free weekly newsletter at jeffrich.substack.com. And you can also buy my book, From the Burning Archive, Essays and Fragments, 2015 to 2022, which has a number of essays on history in it, as well as my essays on unravelling empires, on social fragmentation, on literature, cultural decay, and the story is of how I sort of, gradually, I guess, came to be the independent author that I am. And then you can also, if you wish, if you're into poetry, you can also read buy my book, Gathering Flowers of the Mind, collected poems, 1996 to 1920. Thanks for joining in, Fish, for watching the live stream. Thanks for everyone for watching. I'll be back next Tuesday with a live stream that I think at this point will probably focus on Australia, India, America, and that whole little nexus, perhaps reflecting on some of the issues that have come up with Narendra Modi's visit to Australia. Modi comes to Sydney. Perhaps Modi comes to Australia. And until next time, I will ask you all to like and subscribe, and I will see you in